A very good evening to all our viewers. Our focus today on the special broadcast on the Mojo Story platform is on Pakistan. For those of you who are watching what's happening in the subcontinent, and this may seem like a moment of deja vu, the opposition has come together to take on Imran Khan, the Prime Minister. The pictures you see on your screen are of massive opposition rallies that have taken place with the PPP and the Nawaz Sharif's PMLN joining hands. The Sharifs have even been taking on the Pakistan military. Now, at a time when Pakistan is back in focus, there is a very, very compelling new book that has just been released on Pakistan by somebody who spent a long time there chronicling the ups and downs, the twists and turns of the country before he was unceremoniously asked to leave. My guest today on the program is Declan Walsh, senior journalist and author, presently with the New York Times, reporting from Africa. But he spent a considerable amount of time, as I said, in Pakistan. And the result is this wonderful book, The 9 Lives of Pakistan. If you haven't read it and you're interested in Pakistan, I strongly recommend that you do. It's triggered, of course, all sorts of opinions, as is expected in Pakistan itself. And let's hear more on that from Declan. Declan is with us. Declan, welcome to the program and congratulations on the book. It just struck me as I was going through it, a very interesting format. You actually profile 9 people, 9 individuals who you believe in some ways capture the story of Pakistan. One of them is Jinnah and the others are from varied walks of life, and we'll talk about them. But this book releases as Pakistan is thrown into tumult again. That tumult for foreign correspondents like yourself must trigger a sense of been there, done that. It's almost as if Pakistan's history moves in cycles.
Yeah, absolutely, Barkha. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. I mean, as you said, it's deja vu. We've seen this kind of political tumult, particularly in the 1990s under the rule of, or under the premiership of Benazir Bhutto, and then, of course, under Nawaz Sharif. We saw it at the end of Pervez Musharraf's rule in the 2000s, and now we're seeing it again. And of course, one of the ironies is that Imran Khan, the prime minister, came to power having himself led these kind of, huge street rallies, where the Long March, which has now become a sort of staple of the Pakistani political landscape. He himself led, marches. He had huge rallies. And I remember at the time when he was coming to power and he was challenging the Sharif government, some people were warning at that stage that, you need to be careful what you wish for in Pakistan. Sometimes if you use this kind of tool to bring down one government or to challenge it, you can also find yourself on the receiving end of it later. And indeed, that's what we see happening now with Imran Khan.
So that's in a way so interesting, the point that you're making, because basically what you're saying is that what one leader has deployed against the other has often come back to bite him in the tail. And so Imran Khan, who was out on the street, sitting in his container, I remember that as if it was yesterday. Today, he's the establishment and the other forces have become the anti-establishment. But I want to talk a little bit about your own experience in Pakistan. You spent several years there till you were given 72 hours all of a sudden to leave the country. Now, people like myself are familiar with that story, but a lot of people who don't know your work that well may not know that. You do write about it in the book, but tell us a little bit about how that came to be. Essentially, it had a lot to do with your writing on Balochistan.
Yeah, so in terms of the expulsion itself, it all unfolded very quickly, just a couple of days before the election in 2013. Again, talking about Pakistani democracy, that particular moment was seen as a very hopeful point for Pakistan. Pervez Musharraf was gone, a civilian-led government had served its term or most of its term, and they were transitioning to a new elected government. So it was this very hopeful moment, and yet at the same time, just a few days before, I get these policemen and an ununiformed, a plainclothes official, possibly an intelligence official, who came to my gate with this letter saying that I was being expelled on account of what they called undesirable activities. So, in a way, this was actually a starting point for the writing of the book. for the first couple of years, I continued to report on Pakistan from London. We were constantly going personally and also through the newspaper, through the New York Times, going to the Pakistani authorities, really at the highest levels, Prime Minister Sharif, intelligence officials when they came to London. And we kept saying to them, please just explain to us what the problem was. We couldn't get a straight answer. But later on, I discovered through a former intelligence official who reached out to me, someone who was also who himself was in exile. He reached out to me and he wanted to talk to me about, the scrutiny I had been under when I was reporting in Balochistan. And when I was in Pakistan, Balochistan was this, underreported part of the country. It's this vast province in the west. It covers over 40% of the country's landmass. And there's been an insurgency going on there since the mid-2000s, basically, led by separatist Baloch groups. But it's also a province where there are other conflicts taking place. It was at the time a sort of muster station for Afghan Taliban fighters who were going across the border. There's a lot of drug smuggling. There's basically a lot of things going on in Balochistan that the Pakistani state, the security state, don't want you to know about. And so when this person came to me many years later, approached me, I went to visit him where he was staying in Europe. He talked about the sort of scrutiny I was under. And then he, talked about how sensitive this whole area was for the intelligence services, for the military, for the security state. And they didn't appreciate, reporters nosing around there where they weren't welcome.
So, in fact, one of the chapters in your book does talk about how somebody in the ISI reaches out to you and you have this meeting. And in fact, more than being sinister, this person is actually telling you about the incompetence, the corruption, the politics within the agency. And I think in one of your comments in one of your interviews was that the ISI is certainly omnipresent, but it's not omnipotent. Can you elaborate on that? Because from an Indian perspective, the ISI is the only sort of overt face we have of the Pakistani deep state. Pakistan's former Prime Minister Yusuf Gilani famously called it a state within a state, effectively implying that it's the ISI that runs the country.
Well, look, there's certainly no doubt that the ISI is incredibly powerful inside Pakistan. And, as an intelligence service, it certainly is very good at doing certain things. But, what my conversations with this person and indeed my own experiences from living in Pakistan suggested that it's not always as good as it would like to be. It's not a professional intelligence service in the sense of, Western ones like the CIA or the MI6, because it is staffed by army officers who rotate out every 2 or 3 years, or rather it's led by those army officers. So it doesn't have the same sort of continuity as other services. But, it does have this very powerful reputation in Pakistan and rightly, with some justification. But, I think it's also important to note that, the ISI is really it is a state, it has been called a state within a state, but I think it's a little more complicated than that. It really operates under the control of the military high command. It has performed political tasks for them. It has meddled in politics. And it's also been, of course, famously involved in supporting jihadi groups in Afghanistan, of course, in Kashmir, in other areas. And I think, when you get to this idea that the ISI or the, calculations of the ISI are not as great as it would like people to believe, it really gets to this idea that the strategic calculations that the agency has made over the years have been very questionable and in many cases, I think, detrimental to Pakistan's interests. We really saw that in the period when I was there in the 2000s and the 2010s, when you had these jihadi groups which had been sort of, either directly supported or tolerated by the intelligence services for many decades because they saw them as doing their bidding in foreign policy matters in Afghanistan, India, elsewhere. And then we saw parts of that militant apparatus turning back against the Pakistani military, against the ISI, and attacking them directly. And so one of the characters that I featured in the book was a former intelligence officer, Colonel Imran, who, had been, he was sort of a legend in the agency, who became, a major player in the 1980s when he was helping to train the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, or for the war in Afghanistan, in the tribal areas in Pakistan. But, in the period when I was there, he went to Waziristan and eventually met his death when he was kidnapped and killed by militants. And so for me, people like that sort of encapsulated this idea that, blowback can have severe consequences for organizations, for individuals, and I think it has had severe consequences for Pakistan as well.
But I would argue with you a little bit on that, because while many sort of terror groups have in fact turned back to bite the hand that fed them, proverbially speaking, there are a whole set of groups that are only used as instruments of proxy war against India. The Lashkar-e-Taiba, for example, being one of them, and the Lashkar's role in Kashmir is well chronicled. And I don't think you have groups like the Lashkar or its political sort of cover, the Jamaat-ul-Dawa, ever turning against the Pakistani state. I think there is a complete continuum. So there are other groups. There are other groups, certainly
Absolutely.
in Waziristan, but that has not happened to the Lashkar. To some extent, it's happened with the Jaish, because we famously remember the time that the Jaish tried to execute an assassination attempt on Pervez Musharraf. But the Lashkar would seem to me to be the one group that has remained a kind of instrument of Pakistan's foreign policy with India.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Even at the time when bombs were going off in Pakistan's main cities, it was clear then that there was a distinction between what became known at the time as the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. So that was shorthand at the time for the idea that you're referring to, that even while some groups were turning against the intelligence services of the state, you still had other groups that maintained those close ties, and to a large extent were doing their bidding. But it's been interesting in recent, particularly in the last year, we've seen, fresh moves against Lashkar-e-Taiba. Now, of course, you can take a cynical view of that, because Hafiz Saeed, the effective leader of Lashkar-e-Taiba, has been arrested and released before, and so on, often in response to foreign pressure. But we do see change. We see Pakistan playing a much more constructive role in the Afghan peace process. The military clearly sees it in their establishment at this time to help try to facilitate the talks that are going on between the Afghan government and the Taliban. They obviously want to make sure that they maintain their influence in Afghanistan. And we also see Pakistan last year coming under, or maybe earlier this year, coming under pressure from the Financial Action Task Force, faced with the possibility of being placed on the blacklist, and that also forcing the government to really take a stronger stance against groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. So, there's certainly no doubt that these groups are still there. Nobody thinks that they have been, completely decommissioned, far from it. But there are at least hopeful signs that there are people within the establishment who, at least for now, see it as in their interest to keep them under control and to stop those kind of activities that were so notorious in the past.
But Pakistan is not out of the blacklist; it's in the grey list when it comes to being sort of viewed as the financing of terrorism. And when it comes to the Lashkar, you believe that there's been a shift. My perspective, of course, speaking very much as an Indian journalist, is that one doesn't see the evidence of that at all. And when you have actually had civilian leaders, democratically elected leaders, who have tried to maybe construct an independent foreign policy with India, Nawaz Sharif most notably, they basically get the sack.
Well, there certainly has been a history of that. I mean, it wasn't clear that Nawaz Sharif got the sack, particularly over his India policy. But, there is no doubt that at time, the military views India policy as its purview, and when civilian leaders try to take the initiative, they find themselves running into very stiff resistance very quickly. I mean, we saw that under Asif Zardari when he was president, and he made some conciliatory gestures after the Mumbai attacks, and then he found himself running into trouble inside Pakistan. So so that is certainly true.
But I remember when Nawaz Sharif was elected as prime minister, and then that was the time when Indians could still get visas and you could go and report that story. And Sharif said in an interview to me that he believed that the Pakistani prime minister was the boss of the army chief. The chief was someone he chose. The next chief was someone that he made a choice on, and he really believed that this was going to be someone who would stand by him. Now, one of the questions, Declan, that has come up again and again, and this goes back to the existential question around Pakistan, since Jinnah is one of the 9 lives that you do profile in your book, uh, the fact that Islam, religion, on the basis of which it was carved, has not been a glue enough to keep this country together. Whether it is how Pakistan treats its Shias, its Balochis, or its Ahmadiyas, or whether it's the insurgent movements that are taking place on the peripheries of this country, there is an existential question there for Pakistanis to confront.
There is, absolutely. But, just to come back to your earlier point, I think, when we talk about groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, there is no doubt, about how destructive they have been. But, and also when we talk about Jinnah and, partition and the role that continues to play, the divisions that still play in Pakistan. But when you look at, what's going on in India, when you see what's going on in Kashmir, which of course is a very important issue for both Indians and Pakistanis, you see the actions of the Indian military. You see the way the sort of discrimination that has been taking place against Muslims inside India in recent years. That's really, that does not make it easier for those in the Pakistani establishment who might want to change some of those long-standing and destructive policies. And in a way, it also gets back to this idea about Jinnah and about the creation of the two countries. I mean, when I was in Pakistan, I remember I would meet my particularly progressive Pakistani friends, and they were very supportive, of course, of Jinnah. They looked up to him as someone who supported the country, or who created the country, and who was a visionary and someone they really admired. But, they, I think, quietly disparaged or were, not supporting the whole premise of the two-nation theory, the idea that Muslims and Hindus could not live together in one country. And for many years, of course, that had been this huge dividing line, I think, between India and Pakistan. Now I talk to the same people, and they speak to me about what they see happening across the border in India. The sort of the discrimination that they see, some of the the actions. I mean, I was really struck recently by the fact that Amnesty International had to close its office in India. That was the sort of thing that one might have expected to happen in Pakistan in the past, but never in India. And I think for some of those friends that I've spoken to, they've said, well, maybe this does prove that, the idea that Jinnah had, that we as Muslims would not have thrived in an Indian state, was right. I don't make any judgment on whether that's right or wrong, but it does strike me that is a step change from what we had just 10 years ago between the two countries.
Yet if you were to talk to your friends in India, I think the response to what you've just said, including mine, would be to say that we might be a country that is having great arguments within ourselves, among ourselves, about what direction we're headed in, what the state and the freedoms of our institution is, what it should be the Kashmir policy, what should be the place of minorities. All of these are really raucous arguments that are currently ongoing. But any, even an Indian sort of, let's say, Muslim politician who's considered extreme by the right wing, let me pick up an Asaduddin Owaisi, if Pakistan were to make a comment on the integration of the Muslims, you'd see an immediate snarling back saying, hey, mind your own business. Don't come and lecture us. We are not Pakistan. So I think that there's a rejection of that hyphenation while
Sure.
arguing vociferously amongst ourselves on all of the things that you've listed, with there being no one opinion. And, literally you can see Twitter, every day is an argument. But I don't know that equivalence would be accepted. That's
sure,
what all of us would say to you.
It may not. This is just my observation. I mean, certainly Pakistan cannot afford to give lessons to anybody on the treatment of minorities. You look at the discrimination against Ahmadis, the way that, countless Christians and countless minorities have suffered. And, the key thing in Pakistan is that the state discriminates against some of those minorities. Ahmadis, do not have the same rights as other people. But I think bring it up to date, one of the disturbing trends that one has seen in India is that, the state also seems to be now discriminating against a minority. And I think, one is not trying to get involved in sort of, mudslinging between the two sides. But when in the book, I thought it was very important to have a chapter early on talking about Jinnah, talking about, the conditions in which both countries were forged in 1947. And it seems that for many decades, Pakistan was, really struggling to find its place. It was struggling to establish the role of religion, the relationship between religion and the state. India seemed to have a much clearer idea about that. I remember the first time I went to Delhi, I was so struck by how, the Nehruvian ideals that had been, articulated particularly in the 50s by Jawaharlal Nehru really seemed to have endured in the political system. And there's definitely been a sense that those ideals have eroded under the present government.
Let me ask you this, Declan. We can go on talking about India and Pakistan, and then that would lead for us to actually basically be disagreeing, because as an Indian whose family actually is a partition family, I think there's a very deeply felt experience there for me. So we'll get into a trap in which we wouldn't agree. But let me ask you the question on whether you believe Pakistan is today a functional democracy. Because the reason I ask this is because there's a sense that Pakistan is post-coup, that you wouldn't see the kind of military coups that one saw before. But that is because essentially the military has figured out that the smarter way is to control the country from the back. And so you're never going to see the kind of coup that led to the original sacking of Nawaz Sharif with Musharraf taking over, but that maybe the military doesn't need the coup anymore.
Look, I think it's an open question about whether Pakistan is post-coup. I think you're absolutely right that, particularly, after Musharraf, it would have been very difficult for the army to take over directly, even if they wanted to. And I think there's been a real sense, particularly under the Imran Khan government, that the military's been able to have it both ways. It has maintained its influence, or even strengthened its influence, over the big issues that really matter to it. India, Afghanistan, the nuclear capability, the relationship with other major powers, like the US or with China and so on, and has really left the Imran Khan government to steward the economy rather, and the economy, of course, has been ailing very badly. So you're right in that the military at this point seems to be both having control of the main policy issues it wants without having to take the political flak for being in charge, which is what happened with Musharraf. And at the same time, they are really intent on controlling the narrative inside the country. When I was in Pakistan under Musharraf, and either after Musharraf was gone, I was really struck by and you will know this particularly, how diverse the Pakistani media was, what sort of freedom journalists had. They couldn't say anything, but they could certainly say a lot. And in recent years, we've seen, even in this summer, we've seen journalists being picked up from the middle of Islamabad. We've seen human rights people disappearing for months on end without being heard from. We've seen TV stations or TV shows being pulled off air mid-broadcast. And so, a lot of this is, as I understand it, is being orchestrated by the military's press wing, and that's a real change. So you're right in that the military kind of has the best of both worlds right now, but at the same time, and this is the really interesting thing that I found about Pakistan, it does have these strong kind of democratic roots. I mean, they may be, twisted, they may be very weak sometimes, but even it is not a country where the military can rule the roost without having any regard for politics, for political leaders, even for political parties. And that's what we see going on right now with Imran Khan. Imran Khan, who, when he came to power, critics said, well, we have to beware of him because he's going to be too close to the military. There's certainly been a fair bit of evidence to bear that out. And yet, the pictures you see on screen right now show these huge opposition rallies taking place. and the government struggling to respond to them. So, if it is true that Imran Khan is very close to the military, this is also proving that they certainly do not have complete control, and that, they really, even if you are the Pakistani military, you struggle to manage the, raucous theater, or that is Pakistani politics sometimes.
Actually, what's always struck me in my visits to Pakistan is how vocal the person on the street is willing to be about the Fauj, about the Pakistani Fauj, as they call it, and quite critical, quite openly critical. And the lower you move down the socio-economic chains, the more you will find that willingness. So there is a section of the liberal elite in Pakistan's drawing rooms that is critical of the Pakistan military. And then there's the average poor man or woman on the street who is not that scared, maybe because they don't have that much to lose.
There's this great irreverence. I mean, I found this, as a foreign journalist, I found this absolutely fascinating. And, you would turn up in some remote part of the country, and of course people were generous and so on, but they were also willing to talk. And I think it spoke to a couple of things. It spoke to a sort of an impulse of people that they wanted to be heard. I think it spoke to the fact that sometimes people are so far down the chain, they feel they've got nothing to lose. And, it also speaks to the diversity of the country, which is partly why it's so difficult to rule. Here's this country that has these huge, many divisions, religious divisions, but also ethnic divisions. And there's a real sense that you have, a powerful center, certainly, with, a political elite and also a military establishment taking sides, one side or the other. But you also have these groups in Balochistan, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in parts of Sindh, many parts of the country where people have another identity that is not necessarily Muslim, that is not necessarily Pakistani, that might be rooted in where they're from. And so, they feel this irreverence towards the center, and they are not afraid to voice their opinions.
Would you call Pakistan a democracy?
Well, it's funny. As I've been talking to people about the book, I usually get asked, would I call Pakistan a failed state? I find the whole failed state paradigm very problematic. It's a bit like corruption accusations. It's sort of used it's used as a way of criticizing someone rather than an objective analysis. Pakistan is certainly a very flawed democracy. There's no doubt about that. But, there are hopeful signs. Pervez Musharraf left in 2008, and, we still have elections taking place. We still have peaceful changes of government. Yes, with all of the things we've just discovered, the heavy hand of the military on major tools and the state not always acting in an even-handed way, not always being inclusive. But, it limps on, and in a way that is the story of Pakistan.
So let me towards the last few minutes of our conversation, play for you something that Nawaz Sharif actually said. And what's interesting in this particular clip is that Prime Minister Modi was a key figure in this argument that's taking place between these two parties, where both parties, the ruling party and Nawaz Sharif's party, are blaming the other for being too close to Prime Minister Modi and reaching out in the back channel to India. So it's in Urdu, but if I think you'll be able to follow, you'll be more than able to follow gist. Here goes.
और जब जवाब मांगते हो तो कहते हैं ऑपोजिशन मोदी की जुबान बोलता है, नवाज शरीफ मोदी की जुबान बोलता है। मोदी की कामयाबी की दुआएं मांगो तुम, मोदी से बात करने के लिए मरे जाओ तुम, कलभूषण के लिए रातों रात ऑर्डिनेंस पास करो तुम, उसके लिए सरकारी खर्चे से वकील ढूंढो तुम, कश्मीर प्लेट में रख के मोदी को पेश करो तुम, कश्मीर का मुकदमा हार जाओ तुम, भारत को सलामती काउंसिल के लिए वोट दो तुम, और मोदी की जबान हम बोल रहे हैं।
So basically, Declan, just to sum it up for anyone who didn't get that, Maryam Sharif, Nawaz Sharif's daughter, saying, you tell us we're speaking the language of Modi, but it's your government that provided consular access to Kulbhushan Jadhav. It is your government that has put Kashmir on a platter and basically handed it over to India. And it is your government, Imran Khan, that passed a midnight ordinance to provide Indians consular access to Kulbhushan Jadhav. And on the international forum, you have basically lost the fight on Kashmir. That is what she's saying. And I actually found it interesting because in previous elections, actually India did not figure that much. Pakistan was a country that was looking inwards. Even Kashmir, the magnificent one-point obsession of Pakistan in dialogue with India, did not figure in campaign speeches except for a perfunctory reference. So I found this kind of interesting. And I was just wondering, when we look back at a Benazir Bhutto, today you see the emergence of a Maryam Sharif. How do you join the dots there? And if you had to tell the story of another 9 lives, would you pick 9 different people?
Well, look, I was really struck watching that clip of Maryam Sharif. Of course, she's a very impressive speaker in some ways, but it is more of the same in Pakistan. Is dynastic politics. Imran Khan came to power saying that he would fight against dynastic politics, and yet he has a very, it's a very personality-based party that he runs himself as well. So it really shows how some things remain the same, even when things change. The other thing, of course, is you're absolutely right that India was not, India was not an election factor in the past, but I think this is probably a function at this, it's partly about these parties jostling for a way to attack each other and to accuse each other of, back dealing with the Modi government. It's also, of course, a function of the big dramatic events between Pakistan and India in recent years, the cross-border incursions, the attacks in Kashmir and so on. And I think it just shows how it may well be a marker for the future that we will see the temperature between Pakistan and India, maintaining at this relatively high temperature, because as you say, a decade ago, it was certainly things were not rosy, but it was not a political issue inside the country.
Now, I want to talk about 2 people, 2 unconnected things. I want to go back to Balochistan for a moment because it was such a big part of your reportage there. And we've been interviewing a series of the Baloch leaders in exile, and I'm going to just try and pull out a clip of one of them, the spokesperson of the Baloch group there. And
नवाब साहब की जो कुर्बानी है सिर्फ बलोच कौम के लिए नहीं है, जितने भी महकूम कौम हैं और पूरे खित्ते के लिए है। उन्होंने जो कुर्बानी दी है, जो एक डिक्टेटर ने एक जुल्म बर्पा किया था खासकर बलोचों के ऊपर, उनकी जो कुर्बानी है वो कुर्बानी एक अहमियत रखता है। आज देखें, जिन्होंने ये ऑपरेशन लॉन्च किया उनके खिलाफ, वो आज किस हालत में है और नवाब बुगटी को आज भी सुनहरे अल्फाज में याद किया जा रहा है।
So the conversation there was about Akbar Bukti, and the spokesperson for his party was basically saying that the men who did this, the men who have basically eliminated our people, and a finger being pointed, of course, at Musharraf, are free. Nothing has happened to them, and that sense that the world is not taking note of the Baloch story. Now, why do you think the Balochistan story has remained untold globally? Why has it not got the kind of attention that some would say it deserves?
Partly it's because it's relatively small, and it's not, in truth, a significant military threat to the Pakistani military. There are small numbers of militants and so on. Their ability to really hurt the Pakistani military, which has so much greater force, is very limited. But of course, it's been notable for the brutality with which the military has suppressed it. It's also been notable for the way that the military has really tried to silence any voices out of Balochistan. Politics in the province are almost completely controlled from the center, and journalists do not operate freely there. Very few, even Pakistani journalists, struggle. And so you see that even though it's not militarily a huge threat, I think, to the Pakistani military, it kind of shows like an exposed flank of the country where you have this group that do not that formally want to secede from Pakistan. They do not consider, they have kind of rejected the Pakistani nationhood. Now, if there were a negotiation, it's possible they would change that stance, but that's their stance right now. And you've also seen in recent years, I'm sure the emergence of the Pashtun civil rights movement, the PTM, coming out of Waziristan and the tribal belt, young Pashtuns who are trying to also, reclaim their rights and to present a new image of Pashtuns where they are no longer seen as either perpetrators of terrorism or victims of terrorism. And so, it gets to this broader idea that I found super interesting, that, even though Pakistan has been best known in the last decade or two for bombs and explosions that were, the result of the Taliban or groups like that. The Taliban have been largely pushed back now, but this idea at the center of the country about what it means to be Pakistani and whether, who gets to set the rules of what national identity means really is, is an issue that's not going away, and it endures in so many parts of the country in political ways. And in certain places like Balochistan, it has found violent expression.
Yeah. In the end, somebody who I have to, in disclosure, say was a personal friend, Asma Jahangir, who was, is one of the chapters in your book and died so tragically. Really, it's not that she and I always agreed on politics. She had in the end, a Pakistani perspective. I have an Indian perspective. We often disagreed, but we remained very good friends. And I just thought that in all the India-Pakistan squabbling, and some of it is deeply felt, it's bitter, those differences may never be bridged. Asma Jahangir, I think, has a respect in India that not many are actually able to command here, and she has a similar respect in her own country. So I just thought you could talk a little bit about her.
Well, I knew Asma from my earliest days in Pakistan. The first time I met her, she was leading what was billed as a mini marathon. In fact, it was a sort of a walk along a road, but it was led by women in Lahore, and it was to prove a point. There had been attacks against female participants in road races in Punjab that year by sort of stick-wielding goons from one of the Islamist parties. And Asma and the provincial government under Musharraf had sort of backed down and were refusing to stand up for the women. And, I went down to Lahore and I found Asma being, leading this crowd of female runners, so to speak, down through the mall to prove the point. And they went 1 week and the police beat them up. And in fact, one of the police officers assaulted Asma, and then she was furious. And the next week she went back and they didn't dare touch her the second time, and people bore her aloft. And that was my introduction to the kind of work that she did that was absolutely fearless. And, I focused on her because, of course, as you say, she was, the giant of the human rights movement in Pakistan. She was also absolutely fearless politically. The things she would say about powerful people, about generals on TV were, unprecedented. And, I think the country is really, much the poorer since she died tragically, just a couple of years ago, prematurely, I think.
In fact, two of the people in your book, other than Jinnah, are no longer alive. I mean, you talk about Salman Taseer at some length. You speak about Asma Jahangir at some length. Salman Taseer assassinated Declan, as you know, for his comments on blasphemy and how archaic that law is. We have to leave it there. It's a fascinating book. It doesn't matter if you agree. I can see a lot of anger in the comments from both my fellow citizens and Pakistanis on some of the things that Declan has said. That is his perspective. It is his book. It is his impressions. And I think we don't have to agree to find something interesting always. And I think that's what we sometimes forget in this crazy polarized time that we live in. Declan Walsh, it's a pleasure talking to you. The 9 Lives of Pakistan, the new book by Declan Walsh. As a completely fascinating churn is taking place in Pakistan politics, it's the one book that I would recommend that you pick up and read this week. Thank you, Declan, and we'll be in touch.
Great to talk to you. Thank you, Barkha.
Thank you. We'll be back at 6 p.m. The Prime Minister is addressing the nation. We'll have special coverage